Hey, welcome back. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Kukulay, and I'm here to answer any and all food science questions as succinctly, as concisely, as accurately as possible. So, we're going to start here with our food science, which is the subreddit that I moderate. All sorts of great questions. I'm definitely going to skip any of the career and education questions, not because I can't answer them, but because I, unfortunately, as a consulting food scientist that runs his own business, am very, very disconnected from the world of the actual corporate food industry. So let's start with this interesting question that popped up yesterday. Oxidation in a protein bar project. Hello, I'm currently working on a protein bar project. It's a whey protein isolate based bar with 4% fat, cane sugar, glycerin, and no preservatives. Water activity around 0.62, moisture content around 13%. For those who don't know, water activity refers to how the water molecules are bound. And so if you have more sugar, if you have more glycerin, you have more salt, the water activity is going to drop because those molecules, those electrolytes are going to bind the water so strongly that it's not available for microorganisms to use as part of their metabolism. You can imagine like beef jerky having very low water activity, so it never molds essentially. After 1 month in standard storage conditions at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's room temperature, the color turns yellow and orange. The taste is slightly bitter. I'm thinking it might be oxidation, but I'm not sure. If it is oxidation, what preservatives would you recommend for this application? Um, yeah, I mean, pretty much anything that fights against oxidation. So the big one is going to be vitamin E or tocopherols, which is a bigger class of molecules where vitamin E is included. Vitamin E being alpha tocopherol, but there being other types which are much cheaper to produce. That's a good one. You don't need very much. You need about maybe 200 parts per million to 400 parts per million. The usage is very low. It's actually dependent on the amount of oil that the food product has. So the more oil it is, the more vitamin E that you need to include to counteract oxidation. There's also a number of other antioxidants, such as rosemary extract. Now, rosemary extract itself can be very potent in terms of its smell. That being said, there's a lot of low odor rosemary extracts on the market, and those are really great to use. I could also recommend vitamin C, ascorbic acid being a very good antioxidant, as well as EDTA or any other chelating compound. And the reason why is because a lot of metals catalyze the oxidation reaction. So what happens is that oxygen is floating around in the air inside your packaging, and if it reacts to any component in the food, it's going to break it down, but it does it at a certain rate. So if you have metals such as iron or chromium inside the food product, you're going to have a really bad time. So chelating agents basically strip, or not strip, but they hold on to those metal ions so strongly that they're not available for catalysis of oxidation. So they're great too. Moving on. This is that same question here. That's really interesting. Okay, so natural yellow for beverage. Anyone know what kind of natural yellow dyes are for beverage? Looking everywhere but not seeing anything that's stable, doesn't precipitate out. Natural colorings are really difficult to work with. There's only so many companies that produce them, and when they do, they still fail in a lot of ways. The biggest one is being thermally stable. So having a natural coloring, it might work fairly well at neutral pH and at room temperature, but when you have to heat treat a product, which you normally always have to in order to make sure that it's microbiologically stable and shelf stable, that's going to give you a hard time because they're going to change color very quickly. Not only does it have to be thermally stable, but it also has to be stable against different pHs. Most beverages are going to be acidic, so you need something that can withstand acidic conditions and also changes to the beverage over time. So it's a pain. But the biggest ones are going to be the compounds found in annatto extract. Annatto is a type of seed that's often used to color different food products, especially those in Asia. And then there's also turmeric. And for both of them, they do have some issues in terms of their their flavoring, but there's deodorized versions as well. So there's a really great answer in the comments here. Yep, turmeric extract. That's great. And then again, there's only a handful of companies that make these types of colorings, these natural colorings. GNT, Sensient, they have those compounds. I've never heard of this one, California Natural Color. Apparently they have a couple of yellows, so that's great. And then Norbixin. Norbixin is the exact compound found in annatto extract that gives it its coloring. And then, of course, there's DSM, which, yes, this person says, I think they were bought by Firmenich. They were, in fact, bought by Firmenich, which is a big, big flavor company. And they also happen to do perfumery compounds. So they do the whole gamut of smell and taste and flavor. Good stuff. Okay. Prototype, reverse osmosis system. So this is a weird question, right? So this person's a student and they want to prototype a reverse osmosis system for a beverage, which is kind of bizarre because if you do that, you're probably going to strip your beverage of everything except maybe some of the electrolytes, maybe some of the sugars, but it's a really good reverse osmosis system, probably going to strip that too. So I don't know if this person's trying to make or transform like beverage waste into water. Seems kind of counterintuitive. Very, very odd question. I mean, basically, if I were to do this, I would recommend just buying a reverse osmosis machine. They're fairly inexpensive. They can run up between $500 to maybe $3,000 for really good ones, and just test it out there. Why would you build one? I mean, they exist. Yeah, I really like this question. So, what makes a cake taste like cake? The question is, I don't know where to ask or if this is the right subreddit. Food science really is the right subreddit for this, yes. But I've been wondering and searching on the internet how food scientists recreate cake flavor that can be applied to either instant powder cake or in a cake flavored drink. I recognize most of them are using vanilla, but is there something more to that that kind of makes me feel like I'm actually tasting cake in the drink? So this is a great question because the process of producing cake flavor matches what's actually happening chemically when you bake a cake. So you've got flour, you've got sugar, you've got butter, you've got all sorts of other flavoring adjacents. And essentially what happens is that during the baking process at that temperature, the proteins and starches, as well as the sugars in the cake, start to react because it's the right temperature where a reaction known as the Maillard reaction occurs. This creates a number of different compounds, but the biggest one for cake in particular are pyrazines. And pyrazines are, there's very specific ones that are variable, but they are the ones that create the cake flavor. Now, these are commercially available. You can have like a natural cake flavoring, or you can even have an artificial cake flavoring. But, all these rely on this particular reaction that you do in a laboratory or in a processing system and you extract them, and then now you have cake flavoring. And it's all it sounds simple, but it's also really complex because you really have to target the right compounds to give you the right flavor components. Let's see here. Looking for a beverage consultant to help reproduce a flavored extract in-house. We've got a couple of kava bars. I don't know what kava bars are. And I think that they're referring to some kind of protein bar or some kind of nutrition bar that has kava extract in it or kava root extract, which, you know, that's interesting. I don't think I've eaten one of those. And are looking to hire someone for a one-off project. We use a couple of flavored extract syrups and trying to bring everything in-house. We'd like to hire someone affordable to help us figure out a good replacement for one of the syrups that we can make ourselves. If anyone has advice on how to find newer product developers or would be interested in talking about the project, please hit me up. Thanks. Um, the big red flag here is someone affordable because the truth is, there's there's very few people who are affordable. I mean, I guess that depends, right? What's your budget? But beverage consultants are not a dime a dozen. They do go through a lot of either corporate experience and training, or they have developed their own palette for training. Beverage consulting is actually really difficult. It's very niche situation. I do a lot of beverage consulting myself, but I'm by far no expert. So in any case, here's the truth of it. These flavored extract syrups have taken a long time to be developed. They could take months to develop, if not maybe a year. So it's not as simple as saying like, yeah, let's just replicate this. You could, you're not going to get a very good product. You're probably going to get maybe 70, 80% of the way there, but there's going to be a lot of components or flavorings that you're missing, as well as the shelf life stability. So there's a lot of testing that goes on in developing these syrups. Now, this person wants to replace them for their own commercial process, and I don't recommend it because it can cost you quite a bit in order to develop these flavored syrups, anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000 for just a person to do it. It could all go all the way up to $20,000 to $30,000 for a team to do it, a formulation team. I don't see why that would be worth it. I mean, for that amount of money, you can buy you buy loads and loads of the commercial syrup. But of course, understandably, people are trying to cut costs, increase their margins. This is probably not the best way to do it, unless you're sure in the next 5 years that investment's going to pay off. Don't recommend it. All right, here's some more degree advice. Let's get that. Operation assistant. Yeah, skip that. So let's see here. Ooh, realistic pay for new graduates. Have no idea. This is not in my wheelhouse. Cool question. So computer science major wanting to work in food science. Well, so this person studied computer science and they're interested in getting into food science. It is a career question, yes. However, this is an interesting one because it touches on a lot of interests that I've seen in the subreddit and in regular world as well, where a lot of people are very interested in getting into food science, but they have some kind of adjacent degree. So fairly straightforward for chemistry or biology or even engineering. There's a lot of niches in the food industry, and you can get into that very quickly. I highly recommend flavor because they don't really care that much whether or not you have a food science degree. They just care if you know how to compound stuff. So that's good stuff. And then, computer science is a little different as a STEM. It's not necessarily something that has lab experience, but very, very interesting enough, there's probably a growing amount of opportunities where there's software design of different food instrumentation, food flavor design, that sort of thing, formulation design. And I can imagine that in the future that with the growth of artificial intelligence, that's going to be in higher demand. However, food industry is definitely 10 to 20 years behind the rest of the world, mostly because we really don't have the margins to be doing a whole lot of innovation. So I don't really see necessarily that moving forward very quickly, and computer science is probably going to lag behind as a possible way to get into food industry. Um, a little tough, definitely a little tough. Oh yeah, I really like this question. So oxidized citrus at the cut. So this person, based on their username, I believe they're a chef. So did a bit of searching, and it sounds like this is simply oxidation along the cut edges. Is this correct? With coating it with acid, its own juice help prevent this. Any insight would be appreciated. So you can see here that at the edges of the lime wedge here, you see this browning. And usually this browning, yes, is due to oxidation, a very specific type of oxidation. So there's an enzyme here called polyphenol oxidase, which is found in a lot of fruits and vegetables. Essentially, like when you cut an apple and you leave it out for too long, polyphenol oxidase is the enzyme that's responsible for making it kind of brown and mushy. There's a lot of other enzymes. That's really simplifying it, but for the most part, it's polyphenol oxidase. So what you can do is essentially attack it or prevent it from reacting with oxygen firsthand. I would recommend dunking this in ascorbic acid or vitamin C, very dilute solution. We're talking something like 0.2% to 1%. You don't need a whole lot, but essentially, vitamin C is very good at scavenging oxygen and preventing it from further reacting with the lime wedge. But a little fancy trick that I was reading in a research paper was that some you can also add a little bit of bromelain and papain. These are enzymes that are commonly found in pineapple or papaya, and they're proteases or enzymes that are designed to break down protein. Now, polyphenol oxidase is an enzyme, which is also happens to be a protein. So if you add this, the bromelain or papain will break down the polyphenol oxidase and prevent it from reacting at all. which I find is a really cool process that you can use one enzyme to destroy another. I find that super cool. Probably because I studied enzymes for my dissertation. All right, natural flavors. I have a hard time with this question. So I want to learn more about natural flavor. Like, for example, what is the difference between cinnamon and cinnamon flavor? It doesn't take much real cinnamon to flavor something, so it's not like it needs the boost. Why do I feel hungrier after eating food with flavorings? Why does natural flavoring make food taste unnatural when you're used to a whole food and clean diet? Why is nobody allowing to tighten regulations how this is regulated? It seems like no one asks questions. So, the reality is that the natural flavorings industry is very, very tightly regulated. There's a lot of overhead costs for the bureaucracy, and actually, it's very hard to make money in that. So, actually, you end up only with like a handful of companies that are very good at doing that. Um, yeah, and then maybe like a whole number of small companies that are surviving just to do that. So it's that's not a very accurate thing to say. No idea why they would feel hungry after eating food with flavorings. That's a very bizarre thing. I wonder if they have more of a psychosomatic effect where, they're eating something and then they happen to see that has natural flavorings and then they go, oh, like I feel hungry. I don't know what that means actually. Um, and then I'm not gonna touch them on this one, this little bit here. I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm lot of controversy on that one for sure. I don't know what tasting unnatural means, but there's a lot of things I think come from the ground that taste very unnatural. Like for example, mold. Mold tastes very unnatural. So anyway, I'll just focus on this bit. So you really want to have flavorings, and the reason why is because if you have cinnamon powder, you don't want to add the whole cinnamon powder. A, B, cinnamon powder is going to degrade a lot faster because it has a lot of other components. Makes the cinnamon flavor itself, which is just primarily the compound cinnamaldehyde, is going to make up maybe 1 to 5% of the mass of that. So you really have a whole lot of other material that's really not necessary, and you want to keep it stable. So really what natural flavorings are on extracts, you're either alcohol or another solvent, and you pull out all those compounds and then you either distill them or you remove the solvent under vacuum, and what's left is some kind of oil or resin. That's your natural flavoring. Now, that's again an oversimplification, and there's a whole other class of natural flavorings that can be developed or produced, especially using enzymes. I won't necessarily go into that, but it's a very wild world. There's a lot that goes on into it, and I know that people are afraid or scared, but rest assured, a lot of regulations are involved to ensure that natural flavorings are safe. That's a really big one. And of course, when you're formulating, you really want to make sure that your flavorings are as potent as active as possible. So sometimes you strip other components of the flavoring itself. So you have just the very specific active component that gives your product a flavor, a very different and unique flavors as well. This is a nutrition question, so I'm going to skip that. Not a nutritionist. Please don't get us confused. Food scientists are not nutritionists. Thank you. I need to inhibit enzyme without heat treating. Recommendations for a tasteless additive to do this. So really, this person is working on making a ginger puree, and they want to use it for some kind of cooking application, I imagine. And it's funny because if you read this username, I have a suspicion that they're either Thai or Vietnamese. So I'm Vietnamese, by the way. So yeah, again, any question involving enzymes, I'm all about because I did so much work on them. So anyway, the big one in ginger puree is an enzyme called zingiberine. And zingiberine is very, very similar to bromelain or papain, which are those enzymes that's found in pineapple and papaya. And there's even one in kiwi, which is very fascinating, but it doesn't work quite as well as strongly as pineapple or papaya. So anyway, if you're trying to inhibit this, what I highly recommend is taking whatever ginger puree or extract, whatever it is, and heating it up to 50 to 55 degrees Celsius, basically sous videing it. And that way you're really holding on to a lot of the flavor, But really interesting enough, zingiberine, because it is a protease that breaks down proteins, will destroy itself. So it's a process called autolysis. And the protease, because it chews up proteins, it'll chew up neighboring zingiberines. And within an hour or two at 50 to 55 degrees Celsius, you'll destroy all of the zingiberine. Really cool process. So you don't really have to overtreat the uh, the puree. And you can do that with pineapple or you can do that with papaya. So highly recommend that if you're looking to try to destroy that particular aspect of those fruits and vegetables. So just for clarification, you see here that at room temperature, not a whole lot going on. But the activity coefficient, it definitely increases. I don't know why I said coefficient. It's just activity level increases as the temperature rises, kind of hitting a plateau at 60 degrees Celsius. I don't recommend 60 degrees Celsius because a lot of reactions happen at that temperature. So you want to kind of hold it at 50 to 55. Got to be a little higher than 45 because a lot of bacteria can grow at that temperature. But really cool stuff. I love sous vide. I think there's so much interesting chemistry and reactions that can occur using that kind of technology. Very cool stuff. Here's another question. Proteins found in brown rice that are not in white rice. Question is about, can anyone point to me the different proteins found in brown rice, the bran and germ, that are not in white rice? Question may sound weird, but I've noticed when eating brown rice, it makes me really hot for hours on end. I don't get those symptoms when eating in white rice. I might be sensitive to something in the brown rice and trying to pinpoint whether it's some protein in brown rice. The truth of the matter is that a lot of the proteins that are found in the bran and in the germ are very similar to what's found in white rice. So it's unlikely to be an allergen because there's obviously going to be cross contamination. So unless you're really like shoveling it in, I guess you would be if you're eating only brown rice, but I highly doubt that that's the issue. Now, there could be enzymes in the germ itself or in the bran itself that interact with other components. And an example would be that a lot of bran and germ have a lot of oils. That's where rice bran oil comes from, for example. And those oils can cause a lot of different reactions, especially if they're degraded. If there's an enzyme like a lipase, which are enzymes that break down lipids, and that's creating some kind of byproduct that is interacting with your body. Example being like aldehydes. Aldehydes are a certain kind of class of compounds that are formed when you break down fats, and they could actually cause some havoc there. The other idea would be that maybe there's some kind of polyphenol. Polyphenols is a really, really big class of compounds that are found in the fiber fraction, and they can react to other proteins in your body. A lot of inhibitors, actually, a lot of enzyme inhibitors are found in the polyphenol fraction. So that could be it. Very weird thing. I've never heard of anyone eating brown rice and getting hot. I definitely have heard of people eating durian and getting hot. That's a very well-known phenomenon that I remember my mom telling me if I ate too much durian or jackfruit, I would get hot. I really should look up whether or not that's true. All right, help with estimations for research on food product development. Let's see what's going on here. So this person is working on their PhD. They want to develop a new food product with limited resources and equipment. Welcome to the club. So really want to do a complete study. Okay, probably not going to happen. Unfortunately, you definitely do. So they want to do shelf life and product longevity. You can do a really simple one, which is to just leave something at whatever conditions you want, room temperature, in the fridge, whatever. And then, you have like 5 or 10 triplicates of this product, and then you test it every month and then see what's going on. That's like the simplest way to do it. But if you really want to get hardcore, you got to use analytical techniques and evaluate specific compounds that affect the shelf life, whether or not that's flavor compounds or texture components, et cetera, et cetera. Life cycle assessment. I personally have not done this life cycle assessment. There's a lot of free software out there, a lot of freemium environmental software products that can do a life cycle assessment. I think it's really difficult for the food industry because there's not a lot of information, a lot of the design of these processes, so it can be a little challenging. This is a lot more for plastics or material goods. I think there's a lot of good life cycle assessment for that. Carbon footprint, lots of data on that. That's not a big deal. Water footprint, not a big deal there. So, I mean, you could definitely do this study. Probably the hardest one that requires a lot of equipment is that shelf life product longevity. So it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for microbiological stability, just shove it in. Just shove it in the fridge or leave it out and see what happens. Is it growing mold? Is it growing bacteria? That one you probably have to do some microbiological labs. So that might be a little more involved. But other than that, shelf life stability could be your issue there. So homemade dicaffeine malate. So dicaffeine malate, also known as Infinergy, it's quite a brand name, very interesting stuff, is made from ionically bonded caffeine and malic acid. The malic acid helps to lessen the crash of caffeine. That's a really interesting aspect. I imagine any acid would do that, so I don't think it's uniquely malic acid, but I'd have to double check with that. If I mix caffeine powder and malic acid powder, will have the same effect. I'm not sure if the ionic bond is key to the effect. I believe it is because an ionized caffeine is going to have a different absorption rate than pure caffeine, just because pure caffeine is somewhat fat soluble, and so it can go through cell membranes fairly quickly, whereas an ionic caffeine is going to have to go through some kind of ionic transporter. It doesn't quite make it through the cell membrane as quickly. So, as you're absorbing it into your intestines, there's going to be a little bit of a traffic jam there. So, this person says, basically, can I make it at home? I don't recommend it unless you have a background in chemistry and biology or some kind of lab-based science and you know how to use a lab scale and you know how to do math and you also know chemistry stoichiometry, which is basically calculating how many moles. It's a really weird term, but moles is like the number of molecules that's actually there based on the molecular weight of the compound. And you know exactly that it's 1 to 1, like one caffeine to one malic acid, and then you calculate the mass that goes into that. Then maybe, yeah, sure. Go for it. I don't think, honestly, if you do have that background, you're probably not going to ask this question because you'll know very well that it's fairly straightforward. But if you don't, the reason why I highly don't recommend it, and I apologize, this is dicaffeine malate, so it's going to be 2 caffeines per malic acid because there's 2 carboxylic acid groups in malic acid. But in any case, you really don't want to do that because caffeine at too high of a threshold, if you miscalculate, if you do some funny math, if you're not sure what you're doing, can really hurt you. And caffeine is one of those weird over-the-counter things that, in the end, actually has a lot of restrictions because you're more or less likely to hurt yourself, especially if you're giving this to young kids that aren't fully developed. Most likely not. This person's probably an adult that's only giving it to themselves, but something to keep in mind. So our prebiotic development is going to be saturated soon. So to give you a quick background, prebiotics are very different from probiotics. So probiotics are microorganisms, primarily bacteria, that you take orally and goes into your gut and supposedly is supposed to confer benefits. I only say supposedly, not because there isn't research on it and very well validated research, but most likely when you're taking probiotics from a commercial source, they don't necessarily have the microorganism of interest or they jack it full of other microorganisms that are a lot cheaper. And these microorganisms aren't necessarily going to survive the gut microbiome slash they're going to be destroyed by the acid, which is an unfortunate truth of the sort of supplement probiotic industry. Is that hard to tell if these are actually well validated because it takes a lot to make a probiotic deliver its results. Most of the time, you need to freeze dry it, and that's a very costly process, and not everyone does that. And secondly, during shelf life stability testing or determination whether or not something is alive, usually they're just using basic microbiology tests. They're not actually evaluating whether or not in 12 months the probiotic is able to withstand and survive the gut microbiome. So something to keep in mind. So prebiotics, on the other hand, are not probiotics. They are the fuel for probiotics. A lot of them are fibers or sugars that these microorganisms need to survive. They have a very specific niche and condition in which they live. And a lot of the fibers that we eat and a lot of polyphenols found in the fiber fraction that we eat are used as fuel by these microorganisms, especially those that live in the large intestine, because that's where we basically absorbed everything, whether that's starches, sugars, proteins, etc. There's really not much left in there for these microorganisms to eat, but they love the fiber because we don't absorb it, but they can break it down. So a lot of these prebiotics have been used as a sort of new supplement design where you take your probiotic and you combine it with a prebiotic, and there's some kind of potential synergy there. Again, a lot of validated research, but the question remains of is that ingredient actually going to do what it's supposed to do at a commercial level? So this person, I know this guy. He's one of the moderators. Cool guy. Really appreciate him. They appreciate all the work that he does. But essentially, he's wondering if prebiotics are going to be a saturated market. I won't really go into all this, but the big ones are that there's a lot of different ways to make prebiotics. You can take a fiber, you can chop it up with an enzyme, you can treat it with different processes to create more complex fibers, you can make less complex fibers, but essentially the sugar ratios are changed and there's different types of fibers and the different microorganisms that are capable of cleaving it are able to survive at different conditions, yada, yada, yada. So there's a lot going on there. But that being said, the question is it going to be commercially viable? And unfortunately, there's a lot that goes into just making fiber itself. It's an extract that's removed from a lot of processing systems. So, like, for example, if you're juicing lemons on a commercial scale, a lot of that pulp, a lot of that rind has pectin and has other fibers. You can extract that and you can basically make a supplement from it. But, it doesn't taste great. So, you also have that aspect. Like you want good tasting flavors. So that's yeah, there's probably limitations to how far that's going to go. I think there's a lot of research to be done, and I think it'd be really interesting to learn. But I think that's more going to be involving whole fruits and vegetables and understanding their long-term effects, consuming them as far as it goes with the gut microbiome. Being on the commercial scale, it probably has been saturated, unfortunately. I do think there's a educational component as well as a marketing component of, hey, like consumers, like learn about prebiotics. But other than that, that's probably as far as it goes. What does it mean to major in food science? That's a really vague question. I'm sure tons of people have answered that. Please help me develop a very basic water flavor enhancing solution. Okay, so this person isn't super happy about the current water enhancers on the market, and they want to be able to make it at home. Again, I have a little bit of issue with this because it takes so much time and energy to develop these products. They're pretty good. I mean, not all of them. I personally am able to hack through a lot of these ingredient formulations and develop something nicer, but I can't tell myself that it's necessarily more cost effective. So, if you're doing this at home, one of the challenges, of course, is being able to measure stuff and understanding the impact of increasing X, increasing Y, decreasing Y, so on and so forth. If you are going to go that route, I highly recommend a class of flavors known as bitter blockers. So they should have little flavor. They really shouldn't be contributing any. But essentially what they do is there's all these receptors in your tongue. There's about 26 types of receptors that pick up 26 different types of compounds, and a bitter blocker will stop a lot of those receptors from working. Now, they don't stop all of them. Um, that would be the holy grail of bitter blockers, is something that stops all 26 and does so effectively at all ranges and concentrations. But for the most part, you're going to have to use one or two, maybe even three bitter blockers, and then combine that with, on top of it, layering it with the flavor, making sure your sweetener levels are correct. You want to do like a sweetener stacking strategy, which is where you have, one sweetener such as stevia. You bring up the concentration to right before your tongue is able to perceive the bitterness that a lot of people experience, or that aftertaste, the metallic one. And then at that concentration, you stack another sweetener, um, for example, maybe a monk fruit. And then, you only go up to that concentration where you're gonna, right before you experience that off flavor. And you stack another sweetener on top, maybe a non-caloric bulk sweetener like allulose. So that's a really cool strategy. You combine it with the bitter blockers, you'll be able to get there. But again, lots of math, a lot of formulation, a lot of tweaking around. You really got to know what you're doing. So I don't recommend it. Just buy your water enhancer flavor, unless you're really into tweaking stuff. I don't talk about like if you're into it as a hobby, but I don't recommend it as a way to save time or money. Why do cornstarch solutions sometimes taste and smell to me like pork? I played around a bit with cornstarch as a thickening agent, but I don't understand why it sometimes tastes or has the aroma of pork or lard. So one of the things about powders, especially cornstarch or baking soda and so on and so forth, is that they absorb aromas from the air. So if you're cooking a lot and you happen to have your cornstarch nearby, it's likely to absorb a big chunk of those aromas. And the reason why is because cornstarch is a lot of different branches of carbohydrates, and it's able to sort of wrap itself around a lot of different molecules. And a lot of these tend to be fat soluble. And starch is pretty good at actually picking up fat. As you know, if you've ever made a roux with butter, it has actually a really cool consistency, which is very surprising for something that is also water soluble. So that's most likely what's happening is that it's being stored somewhere, it's picking up all these aromas, and then you're tasting it. Sort of like, old cereal or something like that. It's a really weird phenomenon. What happens if you consume too much citric acid in one day? So this person apparently drinks a lot of lemonade and tomato sauce. For the most part, citric acid itself isn't going to be a big deal, but the acidity is going to be problematic. So I used to drink a lot of kombucha, and then I started developing gastritis because I was stressed out during my PhD program, and so I had to really cut down on my kombucha. Now I drink Olipop. So for those who, happen to be in the Olipop industry, I thank you. I thank you for your contribution. Those are really good sodas for what they do. But in any case, yes, you can definitely eat too acidic of foods, and that's mostly because if your body is not very good at dealing with the increase in acidity, it's not able to address it or change the amount of hydrochloric acid that it produces, your membrane is going to be your intestinal membrane is going to be irritated. So that's really what's going to happen. I'm sure there is a toxic level of citric acid. I don't think that people can get there. I mean, citric acid itself is found in our bodies because we metabolize it. We use it in the Krebs cycle where we convert glucose sugars into energy. So there's a little thing called the citric acid cycle. For you biochemistry majors out there, you're very well familiar with that, having to memorize every single step, as I did back as an undergraduate. So, questions for microbiologists and scientists. I apologize if these are really silly questions. I am currently pregnant and am very, very hyper vigilant about food safety and avoid foodborne illnesses. Good for you. Good for you. I think that's really important. The fetus is really not well developed yet and is unable to tolerate such high loads of toxins. So, yes, for anyone who's pregnant, that is a very big concern. So, especially learning about how serious these are called pregnant. So, after extensive Googling, I haven't quite been able to find answers. So, this this was a really funny question, which is basically here she's asking if her husband eats something that could be high risk, like deli meat, um, from a company that I won't mention that is going through a serious food safety issue right now, and he does deli meat. And then if it has listeria and then kisses me, could she become infected? Highly unlikely. Most of the load is going to go in that person's mouth and is not going to be transmitted through the mouth, unless he's like spitting the food into your mouth, which is really gross. I mean, I guess it could be romantic depending on your perspective, but probably mostly gross. So, yes, that if you're basically the person has eaten it and there's been time in between, they kiss you, you're not going to get a foodborne disease. Foodborne disease born on the food.
Wow! Incredible!
So, and then there's another question, very similar. Is it possible to breathe in food-borne diseases and become infected? No, those are tend to be respiratory diseases. But there are certain cases where, let's say that you're in a food processing facility and there's a lot of dust, and somehow that food has already been contaminated. It actually happens a lot with mycotoxins that are formed from fungi and mold. So you have like these cereal processing plants, and there's all this material that goes in the air. People breathe it in. If it happens to be contaminated, yeah, you're gonna have a problem. But a lot of that is gonna be more respiratory. You're gonna have sort of allergic reaction to all these mycotoxins. Foodborne illness. It is born from food. All right. Alternative to lemon juice without citric acid. Okay, so in this question, this person's partner is definitely allergic to citric acid. I have never heard of such a thing. Perhaps. Now, citric acid is normally produced on a commercial scale, historically by extracting lemon juice and then taking it out. But now it's a lot cheaper to use a microorganism known as Aspergillus niger. This is a non-toxigenic mutation that is able to produce a high concentration of citric acid, and it's extracted, and then it's separated, and so on and so forth. So, and it's crystallized, so it's fairly pure. But, and I'm sure people in the citric acid industry won't like me saying this, but there might be very, very small amount of contamination from the mold. Very, very small. And if you're really, really sensitive and there's a protein left over from the Aspergillus niger, you could have some kind of allergy to it. There are known cases of citric acid allergy for sure, but that's usually because of this process. It's not necessarily due to the citric acid itself. If you were allergic to citric acid, you'd probably die. The reason why is because your body produces citric acid again through the citric acid cycle, or this Krebs cycle. It's required for glucose metabolism. So it's not the compound itself, but what comes with it. So if you want something where you have lemon juice or lemon flavor without citric acid, highly recommend just using some kind of lemon extract. Lemon flavoring, the oils are, separated from the water fraction, so there's not going to be any citric acid. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with this scenario. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm sure there's a very interesting story behind that. Possible. Thinking about a career move into pet food. So the smart choice. Career question, but I will say I have two dogs, and my gosh, I really wish that someone in the pet food industry would really make a high quality product. I know it's expensive. I realize now that at the end of the day, you really just have to make a human grade food because there's so many allergens in pet food, mostly because they're byproducts of other industries. So there's a lot of contamination and cross contamination. And my dogs have unlimited allergies. I don't know where they get them. They're both street dogs from Mexico. And so then I guess they wouldn't have really survived very well had they just kept living out there. So we're grateful to have them, but so many allergies. So many allergies. Sugar-free Slurpee or slushy. 7-Eleven came out with an oil Coke Zero flavored Slurpee. Can I just say, I don't know what we're doing in the food industry, but these weird collaborations between two different companies and their flavor compounds and their flavor composition. It's a really interesting branding strategy. I don't know if it's necessarily effective. I'm sure I actually, there's probably like Cheez-Its with Dorito flavor or something like that. Or there's Taco Bell shells with Dorito flavor. Okay, I'm doing more Doritos. Yeah, I'm sure there's some interesting data involving those marketing trends, but I don't think of Oreo as something that should be with Coke. Personal opinion. Maybe I'm old school. Yeah, so it's somewhat misleading. Yes, it's sugar-free, but it still has other carbohydrates with caloric value. Most likely, these are thickeners, or fractionated small carbohydrates, starches that have been hydrolyzed, and they kind of create more of that thickening effect for the Slurpee. So is it possible to make a Slurpee premix that only uses non-caloric sweeteners? Absolutely. So the thing with sweeteners, primarily bulk sugars, is that not only do they impart sweetness, but in a application like a Slurpee where you're freezing something, they contribute to this actual structure of the Slurpee. It helps decrease the melting point and ensures that your Slurpee is actually slushy and not rock hard. If you were to make a non-caloric slushy or Slurpee, you would need some kind of sweetener that behaves similarly to sugar, if not exactly. And that's where I highly recommend allulose. So allulose is a rare sugar that's found in fruit, but nowadays it's produced at scale using genetic modification and microorganisms. Yay! Genetic engineering. Yes, this is the future we live in, unfortunately. Or fortunately, there's a lot to be done in that field, especially in food. In any case, the allulose is produced through that process. It itself does not contain any genetically modified material, but a lot of processes do contribute to that. Or it's an enzymatic process. Neither here, nor there, big details. So the allulose is a sugar. The thing is that we just don't have the enzymatic machinery in our gut to break it down or in any part of our body to break it down. So allulose is calcitrant to metabolism. It just doesn't get absorbed. And so it disappears into our body and then it gets excreted through the very known channels of the human waste system. So I like that because allulose behaves exactly like glucose and any other sugar. So it's able to do that melting point depression. And it's also about 70% sweet as table sugar. So yeah, you'd probably do something like, as talk about this, but a sweetener stacking strategy. So you do a little bit of stevia, get you add that concentration right before it gives you that aftertaste or that bitter taste, and you stack another sweetener such as monk fruit, non-caloric one, high intensity. So both of these are called high intensity sweeteners because they're about like 200 to 300 times sweeter than sugar. So the monk fruit, you add a concentration up to the point right before you're starting to experience that bitter flavor. And then you stack on top of that the allulose. Now you're probably going to need more allulose for the slushy, and the reason why is because cold temperatures actually decrease our sensitivity to sweetness. That's why ice creams and frozen desserts have a ton of sugar. Not only is it to help create that creamy texture because it helps reduce the size of the crystals. Again, that happens here in the slushy as well. But it also, you require so much more sugar when you're eating something that's frozen. And that you can imagine if you melt down the ice cream, it tastes a lot sweeter. And that's because at room temperature, your sweet receptors are picking it up more. Very, very interesting phenomenon. How to mask caffeine's bitterness. I'm working on a project with honey similar to GU Energy, but with adaptogen herbs and caffeine from organic green tea. I can't seem to get the bitterness from the caffeine at an acceptable level. Any recommendations on how to mask it in this application? Needs to be clean label if possible. Thanks. Well, folks, this is welcome to the world of suck. Um, caffeine is very bitter. Very, very bitter. It itself is already a challenge. But now you got adaptogen herbs, which are also super bitter. And you've got caffeine from green tea. More bitterness. There's a lot of polyphenols that come along in the green tea that really contribute to this. So you're not just fighting the caffeine bitterness, but you're also fighting the bitterness of these other components. And on top of that, you want it to be clean label. There's ways to do it without being clean label. Absolutely. But to be clean label, my gosh, there's a lot involved. There's definitely clean label bitter blockers that exist. Mushroom extracts, protein extracts, very interesting stuff. I don't know if it's enough to block the bitterness. You'll probably want to have some kind of acid because that will help kind of slow down the perception of caffeine's bitterness. If it's in an ionic state, it's not able to bind to the receptor as quickly or as well as, say, if you have caffeine. So you really what I'm saying is that you got to add a little citric acid here, which admittedly is not super clean label. If you want a clean label format of citric acid, I highly recommend lemon juice or dried lemon juice. That's really chock full of citric acid. You are going to get that lemon flavor, but you can say that it's lemon juice. You don't have to say it's citric acid. It's expensive, very expensive. No, that whole shenanigan gonna be really expensive to make. How to make my own electrolyte supplement. So I wanted to make my own electrolyte solution. Is enough to freeze dry and blend fruit. Highly do not recommend. It will make a gooey mess every time. Every time I use freeze dried fruit and try to apply it to my formulations, it's a mess. Don't do it. Hate it. Hate it. I hate freeze dried stuff. And that's mostly because I spent 5 years freeze drying hundreds of pounds of onion and garlic. So I have a very strong distaste for freeze drying. But I do love its applications in other arenas, just not fruits and vegetables. Very, very angry about that. what I need to do or make in order to create an electrolyte supplement that dissolves in water and also lets me control flavor. Don't use freeze-dried fruit. Don't do it. This is actually really straightforward. I've made a few electrolyte supplements, some more complicated than others, but the basic structure is like you want a source of salt or sodium, really. You want a source of potassium, you want a source of calcium, magnesium, and whatever trace minerals you want to include there. Maybe some amino acids that don't taste gross. Don't put cysteine, tastes really gross. And another other water soluble components that you want to include. And then the flavors, easy. You just find water soluble flavors and you add those, include it probably in a powdered format. Highly recommend Nature's flavors. I'm not an ambassador of them. I'm not some stooge. I actually really like them a lot because I have about like I have like 30 or 40 of their flavored powders just because I really like the way that it really gets at the natural taste. Really hard to do. I really like what they've done. The source of sodium quality is going to be sodium chloride, just because it's the cheapest. But if you want to get fancy, you can use sodium citrate, which is also a little salty, but it has a little cleaner flavor. It doesn't hit that perception of saltiness quite as fast. Or sodium gluconate, a little expensive. The gluconic acid part is really heavy. So your sodium to gluconate ratio is going to be very low. So it might be a little expensive to do. Same with potassium. That's where I don't recommend potassium chloride because it does have that metallic off flavor. So you either want to go with potassium citrate or potassium gluconate. Again, it's about those ratios. Potassium chloride has the highest ratio of like the maximum amount of potassium you can have with a minimum amount of, the anion. But that's neither here nor there. Same deal with calcium and magnesium. Don't use the chlorides. They're really metallic and really have bitter off flavors. You want the citrate at the very least, or the gluconate if you're feeling like it needs that little punch up. That's because gluconic acid and glucuronic acid. I don't always remember. But one of those has a little bit of sweetness imparted to it. So as a counter ion, it actually doesn't increase the perception of metallic bitterness. I really like that, but it is heavy and it is expensive. Now you also want to have some kind of bitter blocker or something to round out the flavoring. Usually acidic flavors are really good. So fruit flavors like strawberry, kiwi, lemon, orange, really good for that. They help kind of balance out the flavors. And yeah, I mean it's fairly straightforward. Like electrolyte supplements, geez, you can make tons of money in them. I mean it's hard to differentiate yourself because they're so easy to make, but the components are really expensive, and because they're a dry powder, you can distribute them pretty easily. All right, last question here. So there's this strange residue on this salt grinder. And yeah, I mean, this person basically has this salt grinder and it keeps showing up with this salt material and they keep washing it off and it keeps coming back. So the reason why this is happening is because most likely that some of the salt has dissolved because there's a lot of moisture. And so it finds its way into different cracks and crevices, very microscopic levels of salt. Over time, it goes through this process called Oswald ripening, where the microscopic salt crystals grow bigger and bigger over time. They go through this equilibrium. It's a kinetic equilibrium where essentially the larger the salt crystals, the more likely it is to attract more salt from the microscopic crystals. So small crystals are not desirable. And the reason why is because they have a lot more surface area, and really you like to have more of the crystal inside rather than outside. So bigger crystals have less surface area and more volume. It's a really weird phenomenon. It's between geometry and thermodynamics. It's a really interesting field, but very odd, very odd. So, and I bring that up only because it's one of the main reasons why ice crystals actually grow when you have old ice cream. It goes through that Oswald ripening process in the freezer. So even though everything's frozen over a long period of time, eventually everything will move towards larger and larger ice crystals, and so you get that gritty, grainy, frostbitten flavor. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. I find it really fascinating. But anyway, that's it for me, folks. Next week I'm going to be on vacation. I'm glad I was able to do this beforehand. Hopefully this goes well. No problems. Still a newbie, still working out, never streamed in my life, never really edited videos in my life. I had someone else do it. So this is a this is a experiment for everyone. So hope you have more questions. Feel free to reach out and ask. If you're really interested, please go to www.brianquicklay.com and feel free to reach out to me. I'll answer any and all your questions. Talk to you soon. Take care.